Béchar, Algeria, 1920. A group of legionnaires were striding through the ruins of Kolom Beshari, an Arabian fort. They were led by a well-built man, around the age of 40, with deep-set blue eyes and a spiky mustache with points like twin black daggers. The battle was over, and the French Foreign Legion's troops were scavenging through the debris inside the now unrecognizable keep that stood so mighty and tall under the scorching desert sun just a few hours ago. All enemy soldiers were dead, or so they thought, until a badly wounded Arab fired 2 shots at their sergeant, who collapsed to the ground. As their comrades took care of the attacker, a combat medic from Hungary rushed to their fallen leader. He ripped apart the blood-soaked uniform and saw 2 entry wounds on the abdomen. If you get shot in the stomach, you can be lucky and have as much as even an hour to live and get intensive care. But if the bullet hits a major blood vessel, you can bleed out in the blink of an eye. Sergeant Hoffman's luck ended that day. He was a feared but respected officer in the Legion, always well-mannered, even friendly with certain people. He was always calmly alert and collected. Even when he was out drinking, he never got into a brawl. And most people didn't want to throw a fight with him either, as he liked to boast in the circle of his fellow soldiers about how well-versed he was in the use of the garrote, a ligature used to strangle a person. Otherwise, his past was not known to his comrades, and when on a drunken night he mentioned that everyone in his homeland thought he was dead, no eyebrows were raised, as it was quite common in the Legion at the time. The sergeant huskily uttered some words in Hungarian, and the medic's eyes widened in utter disbelief. "I see that I am going to die. My real name is not Bela Hoffman, but Bela Kiss. I killed those women in Cinkota. Every police force around the world was after me." He wanted to continue, but life left him before he could. His body, following the local tradition, was wrapped in a sheet, and he was buried in the fort's military cemetery. Cinkota, Hungary, 4 years earlier, 1916. A group of soldiers arrived at the police station of Cinkota, a small, quiet town close to the capital of Hungary. The Great War had been raging in Europe for 2 long years now, and the Austro-Hungarian army's depleting fuel reserves were being replenished with supplies requisitioned from the hinterland. The troops were in to collect. A policeman eventually remembered his conversation with a local business owner from a few years ago, before the war broke out. A very pleasant man to converse with, also a very peculiar one, as he told the officer about his suspicion that a war would break out soon. So he bought and kept gasoline in barrels for tougher times. He must have kept buying because from time to time new barrels appeared in his yard, but he worked as a tinsmith, so no one batted an eye. The soldiers were directed to the tinsmith's house, looked up at the overdoor sign which in big bold letters said, "Kiss Bela." Mr. Kiss wasn't home. Even though he was no longer required to do so because of his age, he volunteered to enlist as a soldier when the war broke out 2 years ago. The troops entered the empty house and went on to the shed to find 7 metal drums stacked on top of each other. They lifted one to the ground and loosened its sealed top with an axe. When it was prized open, it wasn't the extremely pungent but slightly sweet odor of gasoline that hit the soldiers' lungs, but the foul smell of death. They removed the tin top of the drum to find the terrible stench coming from a bag inside the cylinder. Covering their mouths with one hand, they pulled the bag out, cut it open, and saw what they had feared, a human body. Retching or not, the servicemen came for gasoline, and there were still 6 barrels to go. They punctured another drum, and instead of gasoline, a lock of blonde hair fell out, accompanied by the same appalling stench as before. The autopsy took place in the cemetery of Cinkota, open to the public. At the time, famous Hungarian writer Frigyes Karinthy worked as a journalist, and he was present when they opened all 7 tin barrels. Here is how he remembers the macabre afternoon. One man collects crested pipes, the other insects, the third postage stamps. A true collector is not known for piling things up. He is passionate about organizing. Boxes, shelves, vignettes, a coherent world in which he navigates well, a world that he himself created and from which he would not part for any cost. Bela Kiss collected female corpses. I stood there in the cemetery in Cinkota, in front of the tin barrels before they were opened, watching in turn as the contents of the open barrels were tipped over to the autopsy table. Tin barrels of different heights, equally galvanized precisely, with conscientious work. Those who opened the first barrel did not doubt for a moment that the contents of the others were the same, though this assumption was unimaginable horror. And those of us who stood there at the inspection all took it quite natural for a small woman to fall to the ground from the smaller barrel and a larger one from the larger one. And after the second barrel, we already knew how to turn the barrel, how deep to reach, and where to grab the twine around the neck of the emerging female head, where the loop is, where it leads down to the legs, and how they are knotted together. An orderly, accurate collector works like this, one who understands his craft and loves order. But there were even more. After the autopsy, the detectives searched the tinsmith's home and the grounds around it, finding 17 more bodies, all but one female. Each victim, even the buried ones, had been preserved with alcohol, so they were still recognizable. The investigation of Hungary's most prolific serial killer began. First, Detective Chief Charles Nagy notified the military that if Bela Kiss was still on the front, he was to be arrested immediately. Next came the interrogation of Kiss's housekeeper, who was terrified at first, but then confessed to having an intimate relationship with the murderous tinsmith, not knowing of his killings. She also showed the detective a secret room where she was never to enter nor let anyone in. It was a room filled with books, a desk with drawers, and a chair. Many of the books were about strangling, poisoning, and occult practices, but what was in the drawers was even more chilling. A huge volume of correspondence between Kiss and various women, all in scrupulous order, each and every one of them systematically categorized so that mail from the same woman was kept together. All of them came into contact with Kiss by responding to his personal ad in the newspapers, using the pseudonym Hoffman. The detectives counted 174 marriage proposals that Kiss had received, and to 74 out of them, he offered marriage and kept up his correspondence with them. After going through the vast number of letters and photos, it became clear that Kiss had been defrauding women of their savings for at least 11 years. The identification process began based on the letters, photographs, and clues found on the victims' bodies, and Kiss's modus operandi was soon discovered. He placed his carefully worded advertisements in newspapers, always requiring about the woman's financial situation. Then, when a letter arrived from a not-too-distant woman, he visited her, spending money on her and giving her attention. Meanwhile, he would inquire about the woman's relatives and kept concentrating only on those who did not have close relatives nearby, so they wouldn't be immediately missed if they happened to disappear. The mystery of the sole male victim was also uncovered. Kiss had a relatively long-lasting relationship with a woman called Marie, who began to cheat on him, first in secret, but later openly. This may have been the trigger for him that brought to the surface some deeply suppressed emotions he might have had since childhood. Some experts have even raised the possibility of him having an incestuous relationship with his mother. Feeling ashamed and powerless, the probably impotent Kiss murdered both the woman and her lover, telling his neighbors that they had fled to America. This lie didn't just give a cover story for his girlfriend's disappearance, but also set up his subsequent killings, because the villagers felt sorry for the cuckolded and abandoned man, so they overlooked him regularly, bringing young women home from pest. But where was Bela Kiss? Finding a soldier amidst the chaos of the Great War proved impossible to do, but one day, 6 months after finding the barrels, Detective Charles Nagy received a message from a Serbian hospital claiming that a soldier named Bela Kiss died of typhoid there in 1915. It was followed by another message that said Kiss was still alive and a patient at the hospital. Dr. Nagy traveled to Serbia straight away. The detective was overcome with excitement to finally put an end to this haunting case. But when he reached the ward where Bela Kiss was recuperating, he was in for a shock. The man in Kiss's bed was dead, but it was not Bela Kiss. Somehow, the serial killer had been warned and had substituted the body of another soldier in his bed. After Detective Nagy made sure that all of Hungary knew that the monster of Cinkota was still alive, Tips poured in from every part of the country. Then for years, many unconfirmed sightings followed, as well as theories. The most popular, and probably the least far-fetched sighting, was the one where Kiss joined the French Foreign Legion, but he was also claimed to be seen in Hungary and in the United States. Despite all this alleged globetrotting, no other murders were ever attributed to the monster of Cinkota, but that does not necessarily mean that he stopped killing, only that if he did, they were not traced to him. In 1936, gossip had it that Kiss, who was by then known as the Mystery Man of Europe, was working as an apartment building janitor in New York City. The police went to the building to interview the 60-year-old janitor, but he had already taken off and left no information behind.